The sharp sting of my daughter's fingers digging into my cheek still lingers as her words cut through the silence. One more word, and you're gone. Still, I didn't flinch. My hand slowly rises, brushing the cold spot where she touched me. As the tension wraps tighter around my chest, the weight of the years hits. Her manipulation, her control. While the silence grows heavy, I realize this moment isn't just a mother-daughter fight. This is where everything changes. I'm done. It's time to speak to my attorney. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The evening had begun like any other family gathering, a blend of forced smiles and half-hearted conversations. Elizabeth stepped into Sarah's home, its grandiose interior, a mirror of her daughter's expectations, feeling colder than usual. The tension was palpable, thickening the air with every step Elizabeth took toward the sitting room. It wasn't just the space that felt distant, though. The rift between them had been growing for months, years even. But tonight, something felt different. Sarah's smile, though wide, was thin at the edges like a mask barely holding back a storm. "Mom, you came." Sarah's voice cut through the silence, an exaggerated cheerfulness masking the underlying urgency. Elizabeth nodded, offering a tight smile. "Wouldn't miss it, Sarah." Sarah motioned toward the plush leather sofa. "Have a seat. Let's talk." "It's been a while since we had a real conversation, don't you think?" As Elizabeth settled into the deep cushions, she noticed the subtle flicker in Sarah's eyes, a glint that hinted at something unspoken, something uncomfortable. David, Elizabeth's son, sat at the far end of the room, his expression unreadable, the silence between them thickening with each passing second. He was good at playing the mediator, but Elizabeth knew he was just as exhausted by the tension as she was. And then there was Jacob, Sarah's husband, lounging casually by the bar, his indifference a stark contrast to the storm brewing in his wife. "So, how's work?" Elizabeth asked, trying to ease into the conversation. Sarah didn't respond. Instead, she crossed her arms, her posture shifting into something more deliberate. "Actually, I need to talk about something important," she said, her tone sharp. "Something you're avoiding." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead." "Money," Sarah said, her eyes never leaving Elizabeth's face. "I need it. A lot of it. And I need it now." The words hit harder than Elizabeth expected. The cold precision in Sarah's voice wasn't new, but it still stung. Elizabeth swallowed, trying to keep her voice steady. "Sarah, we've had this conversation before. You need to manage your own life. You can't keep depending on me." "Oh, but I am depending on you," Sarah shot back, her eyes narrowing. "You've always made sure I had everything I needed, and now I need more. You've got more than enough to spare. What's the problem?" The audacity of it took Elizabeth by surprise. She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I've worked hard for everything I have, and it's time for you to start learning how to stand on your own 2 feet. I've always supported you, but this is too much." Sarah's face contorted with something darker than just anger. It was frustration, an old resentment simmering beneath the surface, something that had festered over the years. "You think I can just stand on my own? You don't get it, Mom. I need that money to keep my life from falling apart. You made sure I'd never have to fend for myself, and now you're turning your back on me?" Elizabeth's heart thudded painfully in her chest. It wasn't just the money. It was everything. Years of manipulation, of Sarah expecting things to be handed to her without ever giving anything in return. The emotional toll, the constant feeling of being drained, it had all led to this. A breaking point that had been coming for years. "Enough, Sarah," Elizabeth said, her voice quieter now, but no less firm. "You have to start taking responsibility for your own actions." I can't keep enabling this. Sarah's expression darkened, her eyes flashing with something dangerous. Without warning, she shot to her feet and marched toward her mother. You don't get to lecture me, she spat, her voice trembling with rage. You're not the one who's been holding everything together. You don't understand what it's like. What it's like to have nothing and watch everyone else thrive while you struggle. You owe me this. Elizabeth flinched, but before she could speak, Sarah grabbed her by the face, her fingers digging into her skin with an unrelenting force, her nails sharp. The room went silent, the air thick with shock. One more word, and you're gone, Sarah hissed through gritted teeth, her breath hot and furious against Elizabeth's cheek. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat as the cold fingers pressed harder into her skin. Shock, humiliation, anger, an overwhelming surge of it, flooded her chest, boiling up from a place she didn't even know was still there. She should have recoiled. She should have screamed. But instead, she stood frozen, her mind spinning as the weight of Sarah's cruelty crushed down on her. And then, like a spark to dry tinder, Elizabeth's anger flared. She grabbed Sarah's wrist and wrenched her hand away, standing up straight, her voice calm but icy. Don't ever touch me again. Sarah staggered back, eyes wide with disbelief, her breath ragged as she took a step away. You think you can just talk to me like that? She sneered. Elizabeth didn't answer. She could feel the eyes of her son and Sarah's husband on her, but she didn't care anymore. The damage was done. The family watched in stunned silence, unsure of what to say, unsure of what to do. They were paralyzed, trapped between loyalty to their own blood and the uncomfortable reality unfolding before them. Elizabeth's pulse raced, her mind sharp with a singular thought. This was no longer a family matter. It was something else entirely. And Sarah had just crossed a line that would change everything. Consider this my last word, Sarah, Elizabeth said quietly. You're on your own now. As the words hung in the air, the weight of them crashing down on both of them, Elizabeth turned and walked out of the room, leaving the family behind. The door clicked shut with a finality that echoed in her mind. The real battle had just begun. Elizabeth's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white as she drove away from Sarah's house. The city's skyline shimmered through the windshield, but the beauty of it seemed far away, distant, like something she could never touch again. The streets of San Francisco stretched endlessly in front of her, but all Elizabeth could focus on was the storm inside her, the shock of the confrontation still reverberating through her body. She had never imagined Sarah would do something like that. Never in her wildest dreams. The image of her daughter's fingers on her face replayed over and over in her mind, an assault on both her body and her dignity. The sting still burned her skin, but it wasn't just physical. It was the betrayal, the total lack of respect. It wasn't the first time Sarah had pushed her limits, but it was the moment Elizabeth finally saw her for who she truly was, someone who had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. By the time Elizabeth reached her upscale apartment, she was trembling. She turned off the engine but didn't move right away. The silence in the car felt suffocating, like the calm before a storm. She glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 8:42 p.m. It felt later, like an entire lifetime had passed since she'd stepped into Sarah's house. She needed to talk to someone, needed to hear a voice that could steady her. Richard. Elizabeth pulled her phone from her purse, her fingers shaking as she dialed his number. The line clicked, and the moment his voice came through, she felt the tension in her chest loosen, if only slightly. Elizabeth? Richard said, his voice steady, professional. What's going on? She exhaled slowly, trying to gather her thoughts. It's Sarah, she said quietly, the words catching in her throat. She stopped, her chest tight as she relived the moment again. grabbed me, and threatened me. Richard didn't say anything at first. She could hear the sharp intake of his breath on the other end. He knew. He understood. She did what? Richard asked, his voice colder now, a quiet fury beneath the calm surface. Elizabeth closed her eyes, leaning her head against the headrest. I don't even know what to say, Richard. I don't know how we got here, but I can't just let it go. This is something more than a family issue now. It's... She swallowed, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her. It's a legal matter. I'm done with it. She heard Richard shift in his seat, then the sound of papers rustling, as if he was already preparing to take action. I'm listening, he said, his tone sharp. Tell me what happened. Everything. She explained the confrontation in as much detail as she could bear, each word feeling like it took more effort to speak. As she recounted Sarah's outburst, the betrayal, and the humiliation of it all, Elizabeth could hear Richard's growing anger. But he remained calm. He always did, even in the face of the worst situations. When she finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. I'll have someone prepare the necessary paperwork, Richard said finally. We'll need to look at revising your will. This kind of behavior cannot go unpunished. And I'll make sure we protect your interests. Elizabeth's mind whirled. It was a decision she had put off for years, but now it seemed inevitable. She had been trying to keep the peace, to preserve what little family she had left, but Sarah's behavior, this was the final straw. The emotional manipulation, the constant demands, the assumption that Elizabeth owed her everything, it had to end. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. It's done, Richard. I've had enough. I'm changing everything. There was no more hesitation, no more second-guessing. Elizabeth had spent decades building a life, a legacy, a career. She had worked tirelessly to create something that mattered, something she could be proud of. And Sarah had spent just as long trying to tear it down, to twist it into something that would serve her. Elizabeth could feel the rage bubbling up, not just from the humiliation, but from the years of manipulation that had finally come to a head. She had made her decision. Prepare the papers, Elizabeth repeated, her voice cold but firm. This is no longer a family matter. It's a legal one now. As she hung up the phone, Elizabeth stared out the window, her mind racing. For so long she had tried to protect Sarah, to give her the benefit of the doubt. But now all she felt was a profound sense of finality. There was no going back. Sarah had made her choice, and now Elizabeth would make hers. The silence in the apartment pressed down on her, but Elizabeth didn't feel alone. She felt something else, a strange sense of clarity. As if the fog that had clouded her judgment for so long had finally lifted. The storm inside her hadn't passed, but it was no longer a threat. It was a storm she would weather on her own terms. Elizabeth stood up from the sofa, the sharp click of her heels echoing through the empty room as she crossed to her desk. Her hands moved instinctively to the drawer where her most important documents were kept, her thoughts already moving ahead to what needed to be done. She pulled out the will she had drawn up years ago, the one that had kept Sarah in the will, despite everything. It was time for a change. She flipped through the pages, her fingers trembling with resolve. Tonight, everything changed. Elizabeth stood in the quiet of her apartment, the evening light fading into the soft shadows of twilight. She could feel the weight of the decision settling in, as though the air itself had thickened around her. Her fingers hovered over her phone, and with a final breath, she dialed Sarah's number. The line rang once, twice, before Sarah picked up. Hello? Sarah's voice was flat, as though nothing had happened. No violent confrontation, no unspeakable breach of trust. It sounded so casual, so dismissive. Sarah. Elizabeth's voice was steady, but cold. We need to talk. There was a pause on the other end, a beat too long, before Sarah answered. About what, Mom? I don't have time for this right now. Elizabeth's grip tightened around the phone. She had to remain calm, despite everything. About what happened today, about you grabbing me. Sarah laughed, sharp, bitter. Oh, please, Mom, it was just a moment of frustration. You're overreacting. Overreacting? The words hit Elizabeth like a slap. She had spent her entire life trying to keep the peace, but this was the moment she realized there was no more peace to keep. It wasn't just frustration, Sarah. It was violence, and I will not tolerate it. Not from you. Not from anyone. There was silence on the other end, Sarah probably processing the weight of those words. Elizabeth's eyes flickered toward the desk, where the will she had just revised sat. A cold reminder of the choice she had made. This was no longer just a family issue. This was the line in the sand. I've decided to remove you from my will, Elizabeth said, her voice firm, unshaken. Everything I've worked for, everything I've built, I will no longer share that with you. Sarah's laughter faltered. What? What are you talking about? Elizabeth's words were crisp, final. You crossed a line today, Sarah, and there are consequences for that. This isn't about money anymore, it's about respect. You have none for me, and I can't keep enabling this behavior. The silence on the other end grew heavier, and Elizabeth could hear Sarah's sharp breaths, her disbelief now palpable. You're serious? Sarah asked, a mixture of shock and anger boiling up. I am, Elizabeth said, her voice unwavering. I've tried to be a good mother. I've tried to support you. But you've taken everything I've given you, and you've used it to manipulate me. You've crossed a line today, and I won't let you get away with it anymore. Sarah's voice suddenly became more defensive, more shrill. You think you're so much better than me? You think you can just take everything away like it's nothing? Elizabeth remained calm, though a part of her wanted to scream. I'm not taking anything away. I'm simply not giving you what you haven't earned, and you haven't earned it. Sarah was quiet for a moment, the rage simmering beneath her silence. You've always been so out of touch, Mom, she said, her voice dripping with disdain. Always so old-fashioned. You don't get how the world works anymore. You don't get how hard it is for people like me. You just sit up there on your throne, thinking your money and your success are the only things that matter. Elizabeth's chest tightened, but she held steady. She had heard this before, over the years, from Sarah, from others. But it never sounded truer than it did now. The truth was, Sarah had never seen the work behind the wealth. She had never understood the sacrifices it took to build a life, to create something that could stand on its own. All she saw was the end result, and she thought it should be hers, for the taking. I understand more than you think, Sarah, Elizabeth replied, her voice softer now, but no less firm. I understand that you've never learned how to stand on your own. I understand that you think the world owes you something just because I built a life. But I've given you enough. And I won't let you destroy everything I've worked for just because you want to take it. There was another silence, longer this time, as if Sarah was searching for something to say, something to regain control of the situation. But Elizabeth could already tell. Sarah's power had always been in manipulation, in her ability to twist the situation to her advantage. But Elizabeth wasn't buying it anymore. Finally, Sarah broke the silence with a scoff. You really think this is going to change anything? You think I'll just crawl back to you, begging for forgiveness? You're delusional, Mom. Elizabeth took a slow breath, her eyes flicking to the window, watching the city lights flicker like tiny stars in the distance. There was no turning back now. Maybe I am delusional, Sarah. Maybe I've been delusional for years, thinking I could fix this. But I can't fix you. And I'm done trying. The line went silent again, but this time Elizabeth didn't wait for Sarah to speak. Goodbye, Sarah, she said, her voice steady and unyielding. Don't call me again. Before Sarah could respond, Elizabeth ended the call. She lowered the phone and stood in the center of the room, staring out at the skyline, her heart still pounding in her chest. It was done. The battle was now a matter of law, of consequences. And Sarah had just lost the war. Elizabeth stood there for a moment, her mind spinning with a mix of emotions: anger, relief, sadness. But above all, there was one thing that had been absent for far too long: peace. The quiet hum of the city outside felt like a promise that this was only the beginning. The heavy hum of city traffic filled the background as Elizabeth sat across from Richard, the well-lit office feeling too sterile, too indifferent to the storm raging in her mind. The sleek glass walls framed the sprawling skyline outside, but Elizabeth couldn't bring herself to appreciate the view. She sat, her back straight, hands folded in front of her as she waited for Richard to begin. Richard had been her lawyer for years, but this wasn't a legal matter she had ever envisioned, at least not with Sarah. Elizabeth could feel the weight of her decision pressing down on her, its finality settling over her shoulders like an iron chain. It was one thing to talk about cutting ties with her daughter, to consider the emotional ramifications. But now, here in this cold, polished office, it was real. She was about to sever the ties that had bound her to Sarah for over 30 years. Richard shuffled a few papers on his desk before looking up at Elizabeth. "We'll need to move quickly," he said, his voice steady, but there was a shadow of caution in his eyes. "I'll need you to outline exactly what you want to happen with your estate. We'll start by revising your will, making sure that Sarah's name is removed from everything." Elizabeth's jaw tightened. "Remove her entirely," she said, her voice sharp, as though the words themselves had weight. "I don't want her anywhere near my assets, no access to anything I've worked for. Not a penny." Richard nodded, taking notes, but there was a flicker of concern in his gaze. "That's understandable, but you need to be aware of the potential consequences. If Sarah contests this in court, which she almost certainly will, it could lead to a long public legal battle. Not only will it damage your relationship with her permanently, but it could also damage your standing with other family members. People may take sides." Elizabeth's grip tightened on the arm of the chair. "I've already made my peace with that," she said, her voice low but resolute. "This isn't about Sarah anymore. It's about me. I've spent decades building my career, my legacy, and it's been slowly torn apart by her entitlement, her manipulation. I'm done. She's crossed the line." Richard paused, his pen hovering above the paper. He was clearly processing the intensity of her words. "I understand your frustration, Elizabeth. I've seen how Sarah's behavior has escalated. But I have to warn you, it won't be easy. People won't understand. They'll question your motives. They'll say you're punishing her. The backlash could be overwhelming." Elizabeth's thoughts flashed back to the months and years of emotional manipulation, Sarah's constant demands for money, her tantrums when things didn't go her way, the way she had twisted every gift, every opportunity into a weapon. It had never been about gratitude. It had always been about control. "I've been punishing myself for years," Elizabeth said, her voice tight, "trying to keep the peace, trying to make it work. I've always given her what she wanted, because I thought that was what mothers were supposed to do. But nothing is ever enough for her. Not anymore." Richard leaned back in his chair, his eyes studying her closely. "What about David? Your son. He's caught in the middle of this. Do you think he'll side with you? Or Sarah?" Elizabeth shook her head. "I don't know," she murmured, a flash of guilt flickering in her chest. "I don't know if I can keep him from being hurt by this, but I can't live my life in fear of disappointing him or anyone else. Not anymore." She sat in silence for a moment, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Sarah had pushed her too far, and now. Elizabeth would not allow her daughter's behavior to destroy her peace, her hard-earned success. This would be the end of it. Richard broke the silence. We'll need to make sure that the revisions are airtight, especially if Sarah contests them. I'll also need to prepare a statement outlining your reasons, which could help in the event of a legal challenge. You've got to be prepared for the fallout. Elizabeth's mind raced with the logistics, the potential chaos. But beneath it all, there was a calm certainty. Sarah had made her choice, and Elizabeth had made hers. I don't care about the fallout, she said, her voice cold and resolute. I've spent too long trying to protect her, trying to keep this family together. But I've realized something tonight. No matter how much I give, it's never going to be enough. This is my life, Richard. I've worked for everything I have, and I won't let her take it from me. Richard nodded, his expression serious but understanding. I'll start drafting the paperwork immediately. We'll take the necessary steps to make sure this goes through smoothly. But remember, once you do this, there's no going back. Elizabeth exhaled slowly, her eyes scanning the papers on Richard's desk. They were full of legal jargon, but to her, they represented something else. Control. She was no longer just the woman who had given and given to her daughter. She was the woman who would take control of her own future, her own legacy. Get it ready, Elizabeth said, her voice a whisper of finality. I've made my decision. This is the only way forward. Richard leaned forward, his hands steepled together. I'll begin right away. But one thing you should consider. This could change your relationship with everyone around you, not just Sarah. Once this is done, you may not be able to repair what's broken. Elizabeth stood slowly, her mind already focusing on the task ahead. The weight of her decision no longer felt like a burden. It felt like liberation. She looked out the window at the city lights stretching out beneath the night sky, a sense of quiet determination settling over her. I'm prepared for whatever comes next, she said, her voice steady. This is a battle I've already won in my mind. And with that, she turned and walked out of the office, her path now clear. The quiet of Elizabeth's apartment was different now, more oppressive. The hum of the city outside barely reached her, as though the noise of the world had been muted, leaving her in an unsettling silence. She had made her choice, and now the aftermath was beginning. Sitting at her desk, Elizabeth signed the final papers. Richard had been swift, preparing the revised will with the precision of someone who knew just how far-reaching the decision would be. Every word was deliberate, every line coldly removing Sarah from the equation. Elizabeth could feel the weight of each stroke of the pen. Sarah would have nothing. Nothing from the life Elizabeth had built. When she dropped the pen back into its holder, a strange sense of finality settled over her. The decision was done. There was no turning back. But as the last signature dried on the document, Elizabeth's phone buzzed. It was a text from Richard. The will has been filed. It's official now. She's out. Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen. The process was complete, and yet, a knot of tension tightened in her chest. She knew what would come next. She knew Sarah would not let this go quietly. The days that followed were filled with an eerie calm. At least, that's how it seemed on the surface. Inside her, though, Elizabeth could feel the storm brewing. It wasn't long before the first ripples of chaos reached her. Sarah didn't take the decision seriously. Not at first. Elizabeth's phone rang at 10:45 a.m., an incoming call from Sarah's number flashing on the screen. Elizabeth's pulse spiked briefly before she swiped to decline the call. She knew what it would be. Sarah, angry, desperate, trying to manipulate the situation. But when the voicemail notification popped up seconds later, Elizabeth hesitated before opening it. She knew Sarah wouldn't go quietly, But hearing it in her daughter's voice was a different experience altogether. "Mom." Sarah's voice was shrill, almost too calm. "You really think this is going to stick? You think I'm just going to let you cut me out of everything like this? This is all just a mistake. You'll see. I'm not going to let this happen." Elizabeth's heart tightened, but she didn't flinch. She knew Sarah's game. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about control. Sarah still believed she could manipulate Elizabeth into changing her mind, into making this all disappear. But that wasn't going to happen. Not this time. Hours later, the texts started flooding in. Sarah began with a series of angry messages, then moved to passive-aggressive jabs. "You've lost your mind, Mom. How could you do this to me? After everything I've done for you. I'm so hurt. I don't deserve this." Elizabeth didn't respond. Not once. She'd learned the hard way that any response would only fuel the fire. Later that evening, the phone calls began. Elizabeth let them ring, each one a desperate cry for attention, each one an attempt to chip away at her resolve. Sarah was persistent, calling multiple times. Then came the messages, one after another, until they became something more insidious. The following morning, Elizabeth sat at her kitchen table with her coffee, staring at the phone when it rang again. This time, it was from David. "Mom." His voice was cautious, hesitant. "What's going on? I'm hearing some strange things from Sarah. She's telling everyone that you've lost it, that you're not mentally well, that you're making decisions out of some emotional breakdown." Elizabeth's grip on the mug tightened, the warm liquid inside sloshing slightly. Her son's concern hit her harder than she expected. She knew Sarah would try to twist the narrative, to paint her as the unstable one, the woman who had lost control. It was her signature move. The victim card. "I'm fine, David," Elizabeth said, her voice calm but firm. "This decision has been a long time coming. It's not a breakdown. It's a wake-up call. I've had enough of Sarah's manipulation. This is the only way forward." David was quiet for a moment. "But Mom, everyone is saying things. They're worried. Sarah's making this sound like you're not yourself. People are starting to doubt you." Elizabeth closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of the years of manipulation pressing down on her. "I know. But I've made my decision. I'm not changing it, and I don't need to explain it to anyone, especially not to Sarah." David sighed, but Elizabeth could hear the faintest trace of understanding in his voice. "I get it, Mom, but just take care of yourself, okay?" Elizabeth didn't respond immediately. She had already prepared herself for this. David had always been caught in the middle, torn between his sister and his mother. But now, she knew what needed to be done, even if it meant losing part of her family in the process. As the conversation ended and Elizabeth set the phone down, she felt a strange mix of exhaustion and clarity wash over her. The silence of the past few days had been shattered, not by her own doing, but by Sarah's attempts to regain control. And though the storm still loomed, Elizabeth felt something shift within her. The power to change the course of her life was no longer in Sarah's hands. It was in hers, and hers alone. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls, more manipulative messages, and increasingly desperate attempts from Sarah to regain what she had lost. But Elizabeth remained unshaken, even as Sarah spread lies to family members about Elizabeth's mental state. She knew Sarah's game now, and it no longer had the power to control her. The silence, once deafening, was now comforting. It was her silence, the quiet space between chaos and peace. And as the days passed, Elizabeth realized that this was the calm before the final storm. What Sarah didn't know, what no one could possibly understand yet, was that Elizabeth had already won the battle. The war had been decided the moment she signed the papers. The phone call from Richard was brief, but direct. "We need to talk." Sarah's lawyer has filed a challenge. The words hit Elizabeth like a sudden gust of wind, cold and sharp, but she'd been expecting this. The moment she signed the new will, she had known the battle would intensify. Sarah was not the type to back down easily, not when there was so much at stake. Elizabeth had spent years under her daughter's thumb, but now, with every legal step taken, the tables had finally turned. She arrived at Richard's office early the next morning, her heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floors. The weight of the decision still hung heavy in the air, but there was an undeniable strength in her step now. Every move felt purposeful, measured. This wasn't just about the money anymore, this was about taking back her life. Richard was already waiting for her when she walked into his office, his expression calm but calculating, eyes flicking over the latest documents in front of him. He didn't need to say anything. The look on his face said it all. This wasn't going to be an easy fight. "They're claiming undue influence," Richard said as Elizabeth took a seat across from him. His voice was matter of fact, as if he had already braced himself for the full weight of what was coming. "Sarah's lawyer says you're not mentally capable of managing your finances and that this decision was made under duress." Elizabeth felt a flash of frustration, but she controlled it. Of course she would say that. Sarah's been manipulating people for years, and now she's trying to paint me as unstable. She won't get away with it. Richard nodded, his pen tapping against the desk as he thought through the details. "I know, but we need to be prepared. They'll argue that you're not in full control of your faculties. It's a tactic they often use, especially when the person contesting the will stands to gain from its invalidation." Elizabeth's hands curled into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She's not going to win this. She doesn't understand what it's like to build something from nothing. To earn every single penny. She's always taken it for granted, and now she's trying to take it all away. Richard's eyes softened, but his voice remained steady. "We'll fight back. We'll prove that you made this decision based on your clear and sound judgment. But we need evidence, Elizabeth. Evidence of Sarah's behavior over the years. The court will look at your relationship, and we need to show how she's manipulated you." Elizabeth exhaled slowly, her mind racing. She knew the history, the tantrums, the demands, the constant need for validation, the way Sarah turned every gift into a weapon. The years of manipulation were etched in her memory like scars. But now, it was time to make it public. She had to lay bare the truth of their relationship, no matter how painful it was. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice low but resolute. "I'm done letting her control me. This is about more than money. This is about my dignity, my legacy." Richard made a few notes on his legal pad, then looked up. "I'll start gathering the evidence. We have a strong case, Elizabeth, but it's going to be a long road. Sarah won't give up without a fight." Elizabeth nodded, her gaze steady. "Neither will I." The next few weeks were a blur of legal meetings, document exchanges, and court filings. Sarah's lawyer, a sharp, ruthless woman named Kate Landon, was a force to be reckoned with. She pounced on every possible angle, trying to discredit Elizabeth at every turn. But the evidence was mounting against Sarah. Richard and his team worked tirelessly, compiling a dossier of emails, text messages, and testimonies from people who had witnessed Sarah's increasingly erratic behavior over the years. As the legal battle escalated, Elizabeth felt the familiar stirrings of doubt from her family. David, who had always tried to remain neutral, called her again, his voice hesitant. "Mom, I'm hearing things. Sarah's really going all out with this. People are saying you're not yourself, that you've lost your mind. They're questioning whether you even made this decision willingly." The concern in David's voice was unmistakable, but Elizabeth wasn't about to let him sway her. "David, I'm fine. I'm making the right decision, and I'm not backing down." David's silence on the other end of the phone was heavy, but he finally spoke. I don't know what to believe anymore, Mom. Sarah's not making it easy. Elizabeth's heart clenched, but she pushed the feeling aside. This is your choice, David. You'll see it soon enough. She hung up and went back to the documents on her desk, the weight of the situation sinking in. But she was resolved. The more Sarah fought, the clearer the truth became. The people who truly knew Elizabeth, who saw the years of manipulation for what it was, were beginning to speak out. Sarah was losing support, and with each passing day, her credibility was crumbling. As the legal proceedings dragged on, Elizabeth's confidence grew. She had seen the worst of Sarah, the lies and manipulation, and now she was watching it all unravel. Every court appearance, every document filed, every piece of evidence presented only solidified her resolve. But the battle was far from over. The final showdown was yet to come. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling hearing, Elizabeth sat in the courtroom, her back straight, her eyes fixed ahead. She had done everything she could. Now it was just a matter of time. Sarah's lawyer leaned in close, her eyes sharp with malice. "You'll regret this," she whispered, though just loud enough for Elizabeth to hear. Elizabeth didn't flinch. She looked up, meeting Kate Landon's gaze with a cool, unshaken stare. "I already have," she said softly. "But not in the way you think." The battle was still raging, but Elizabeth could feel it. She was on the verge of something far bigger than just a legal victory. It was the moment she would reclaim her peace, once and for all. The courtroom was colder than Elizabeth remembered. It was a place of power, a place where words could alter the course of lives. And yet, as she sat there, it felt more like a place where the weight of truth would be laid bare, no matter how painful it might be. The overhead lights cast sharp shadows on the polished floors, the long wooden benches lined with onlookers and family, the scent of paper and ink thick in the air. Elizabeth sat tall, her back straight, her gaze unwavering. This was the moment she had been preparing for. On the opposite side, Sarah's lawyer, Kate Landon, stood with a quiet smugness, her sharp eyes scanning the room as she began her opening statement. Elizabeth could feel the venom in Kate's words, the calculated attempt to paint her as irrational, unstable, an aging woman who no longer knew what she was doing with her own life. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court," Kate began, her voice smooth and persuasive, "this is not just a case about inheritance. It's about protecting a woman who is clearly not of sound mind. We are not here to dispute a mother's love for her daughter, but rather the actions of someone who has been manipulated into making a decision that is neither rational nor in her best interest." Elizabeth clenched her jaw but remained silent, allowing Kate's words to echo in the air. She had been here before, listening to lies and half-truths, trying to remain calm, knowing that soon the truth would come to light. Her truth. Richard rose to his feet beside her, his presence a quiet but forceful assurance. He opened his briefcase, laying out the evidence in front of him. The court, full of hushed whispers, waited as he began his defense. "Your Honor," Richard said, his voice steady, firm. "We are not here to prove that Elizabeth Harper is incapable of making her own decisions. What we are here to do is expose the truth behind the manipulation and lies that have been weaved by the person contesting this will. A person who has consistently shown disregard for her mother's well-being in favor of her own gain." Elizabeth felt the weight of Richard's words land like a heavy breath in the room. This was her fight now. Her voice, through Richard, was steady. This was no longer just a legal battle, it was the reclaiming of her own identity, her own dignity. As the hearing continued, Sarah's lawyer tried to paint Elizabeth's past decisions as signs of mental instability. This was a woman who allowed herself to be led astray, Kate argued, who was coerced into cutting her daughter out of her life completely, under the guise of some emotional breakdown. The words stung, but Elizabeth didn't flinch. She didn't need to. Not with the evidence Richard had compiled. Richard continued. We have gathered numerous testimonies from people who have witnessed Sarah's behavior over the years, her consistent demands, her manipulation, and her attempts to control Elizabeth's life. It is not Elizabeth who is unstable here. It is Sarah who has shown time and time again that she is willing to use her mother to further her own agenda. The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence as Richard called his first witness, Maya Grant, Elizabeth's longtime friend and confidant. Maya's testimony was measured, calm, but filled with the undeniable truth. She spoke of Sarah's outbursts, her constant attempts to leverage her mother's success for her own gain, the emotional manipulation that had spanned years. Maya's voice was steady, but her eyes flickered to Sarah in the courtroom, her expression a mix of pity and anger. I've seen Sarah manipulate her mother. I've been there, on the receiving end of Sarah's wrath when things didn't go her way. I've watched Elizabeth give and give, only to have Sarah take and take, until there was nothing left but bitterness. Maya's words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. It was no longer just Elizabeth's story. It was the truth, shared by someone who had been there, who had seen Sarah's cruelty firsthand. Next came David. Elizabeth had dreaded this moment, unsure how he would navigate the tension between his mother and his sister. But when he took the stand, something unexpected happened. His voice, usually cautious, was firm. I don't agree with everything my mom has done, David began, his eyes briefly flicking to Sarah. But I've seen how Sarah has treated her. I've witnessed the emotional abuse, the way she would manipulate Mom into giving her whatever she wanted, even when it wasn't in her best interest. Sarah's face twisted in anger, her jaw clenching as David continued. I've seen her grab Mom's face. I've seen her threaten her. I've heard the lies she tells when things don't go her way. And I've seen my mother, over and over, trying to hold things together, trying to keep peace, until she couldn't anymore. Elizabeth felt a lump rise in her throat as she listened to David. His words were more than just his testimony. They were a confession of sorts, an acknowledgement of the years of pain that had been ignored, excused, or dismissed by everyone around them. Then came the moment Elizabeth had been dreading. Richard stood and, with the calm assurance that had never left him, presented the evidence: text messages, emails, recordings, and even the video of the face-grabbing incident. The damning images of Sarah's abuse and emotional control were laid bare for all to see. The courtroom was silent, the tension palpable as the reality of Sarah's behavior sank in. Elizabeth felt no pleasure in seeing Sarah's manipulations exposed, but it was the only way forward. The truth, once hidden in the shadows, was now illuminated for everyone to witness. The judge, a man whose demeanor had remained impassive until now, sat up straighter in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he reviewed the evidence. Ms. Landon, he said, his voice low and deliberate. It seems you are attempting to paint Ms. Harper as someone incapable of making her own decisions. But I am beginning to wonder if the true issue here is the manipulation and influence exerted by your client. Kate Landon's face stiffened, but she said nothing. The tide had begun to turn. The pieces of Sarah's lies were falling apart, one by one. Elizabeth took a deep breath, her body tense but steady. She had come this far, and now, finally, the truth could no longer be ignored. The judge was beginning to see it, what she had known all along. Sarah's game was over. The courtroom had become a battlefield. The once sterile walls, the wooden benches, the polished floors, all of it felt heavy now, as though the weight of truth was pressing down on every inch of space. And at the center of it all sat Elizabeth, her back straight, her gaze unwavering. She had been through this before, those moments of quiet, when Sarah's words cut like knives, when the pressure to give in almost seemed too much to bear. But not today. Today, she would not be moved. The court session had dragged on for hours, and Sarah's lawyer, Kate Landon, was relentless. With every question she asked, she tried to unravel the seams of Elizabeth's resolve, pulling at threads that might weaken her defense. Sarah's strategy had shifted now. She wasn't just challenging the will, she was attacking Elizabeth's mental state, painting her as fragile, as someone who couldn't be trusted to make decisions. Kate's tone was sharp, her voice dripping with insinuation as she tried to push Elizabeth into a corner. "Ms. Harper," Kate began, her voice cool and calculated, "isn't it true that you've been experiencing emotional instability for some time now? That you've been unable to manage your finances and have relied on your daughter for support?" Elizabeth didn't flinch. She knew exactly where this line of questioning was going. She had been here before, listening to Sarah spin her web of lies, and now, with Kate doing her bidding, it felt like déjà vu. But she remained composed. Every word out of Kate's mouth was an attempt to paint her as something she was not, a woman who had lost control. "I have been managing my finances perfectly fine," Elizabeth replied, her voice calm and steady. "And I have never relied on Sarah for anything more than her being a daughter. The only thing I've relied on her for is to treat me with respect and not use me as a means to an end." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Kate's lips twisted into a tight smile, as if she had anticipated this response. But Elizabeth could feel it. She wasn't playing into Sarah's hands anymore. She wasn't the vulnerable woman she had once been. Kate pressed on, undeterred. "Your daughter claims that you've been under undue influence, that you've made this decision out of frustration and anger. Doesn't that sound like a mother who was pushed too far? Wouldn't that suggest that your decisions are, in fact, irrational?" Elizabeth held her gaze steady, unwavering. "I made my decision with clarity. Every person in this courtroom knows the truth about my relationship with Sarah. She has manipulated me for years, taken advantage of my love, and only when I stopped enabling her did I find the strength to make the choice I did. This isn't a matter of instability. This is a matter of self-preservation." The words landed like a heavy blow. Richard, seated beside her, shot a quiet nod of approval. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but it gave Elizabeth the strength to keep going. She could feel the pressure mounting, but she wasn't the woman she used to be. She had seen Sarah's true nature, and it had taken everything inside of her to stand up to it. As the day wore on, Sarah's lawyer grew more desperate. The questions became sharper, more invasive, designed to provoke a reaction. But Elizabeth remained unmoved. She didn't need to shout or fight back. She didn't need to explain herself anymore. The evidence was already out there. Testimonies, recordings, the video of Sarah's violent outbursts. All of it told the story, and Elizabeth would let the facts speak for themselves. But with every failed attempt by Sarah's lawyer to break her, the frustration in the room was building. Elizabeth could see it in Sarah's eyes. This wasn't going how she had planned. For so long, Sarah had held the upper hand, had used her mother's kindness as a weapon. But now, the control was slipping away, piece by piece. Then, it happened. Kate Landon took one last shot, a desperate attempt to claw her way back into the game. "Ms. Harper," she said, her voice a little louder now, "your daughter has testified that you've always been generous, always willing to give. Can't we assume that you've simply changed your mind out of anger? That you're making a decision you'll regret?" The room went still. Sarah, sitting behind her lawyer, gave a tight smile. She believed this was her moment to regain control. But Elizabeth's gaze never wavered. "I'm not angry, Ms. Landon," Elizabeth said quietly, her words cutting through the air with chilling clarity. "I'm not acting out of vengeance or frustration. I am acting out of the simple truth that I no longer want to be manipulated. I'm not asking for sympathy, and I'm not here to explain myself. This is about my life, my choices, and what I've worked for. The fact that Sarah wants to take that away from me speaks more about her character than anything else. Sarah's smile faltered. Her hands clenched on the table in front of her, her body language betraying her growing frustration. Elizabeth could see it now. The mask was slipping. The lies were being exposed, and there was nothing Sarah could do to stop it. The judge, who had remained silent throughout the entire exchange, leaned forward slightly. His brow furrowed as he scanned the courtroom, his eyes now focused on Sarah. "Ms. Landon," he said, his voice firm, "it seems to me that the testimony presented here is raising significant doubts about your client's credibility. The evidence presented suggests that this matter is not as simple as a mother acting out of spite. There seems to be a pattern of behavior from Ms. Harper's daughter that demands closer scrutiny." Kate Landon's face went pale, her lips pressed together in a thin line. The pressure was beginning to mount for Sarah, and she could feel the room shifting in Elizabeth's favor. As the day wore on, Elizabeth remained calm, letting the facts speak for themselves. The courtroom, once filled with whispers and tension, was beginning to lean toward her side. Sarah's manipulative tactics were no longer working. The facade was crumbling. Sarah, however, seemed unable to accept that reality. As Elizabeth glanced over at her, she saw her daughter's face twist with anger, her eyes flickering with a mixture of disbelief and fury. It was as if she couldn't comprehend that the tide had truly turned against her. Elizabeth couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of satisfaction. The battle was far from over. But she knew, deep down, that she had already won. The truth was out, and there was nothing Sarah could do to take it back. And as the court session drew to a close, Elizabeth sat taller than ever, her head held high, the weight of years of manipulation finally lifting from her shoulders. The courtroom was still, the tension thick in the air. The judge's gavel had just come down, the sharp sound echoing through the room, signaling a pause. Elizabeth's heart beat steadily in her chest, each thud a reminder that this moment was coming. She could feel the years of uncertainty, the years of Sarah's manipulation and control, slowly draining away, leaving behind a calm certainty that she had made the right decision. "Ladies and gentlemen," the judge began, his voice firm but not unkind. He scanned the room, his gaze lingering briefly on Sarah, then turning to Elizabeth. "After careful consideration of the evidence presented, I find that the will in question stands. The decision made by Ms. Harper is final. Sarah Harper is removed from the inheritance." The words landed like a heavy weight, and for a moment, Elizabeth felt the gravity of them sink into her bones. She hadn't expected the verdict to come so swiftly, nor had she anticipated the sense of relief that flooded her so immediately after. The air seemed to change in that instant. Sarah's mouth opened, her eyes wide with disbelief. Her hands, still clenched on the edge of the table, trembled slightly, as if the truth was too much to bear. Sarah's carefully constructed facade of control cracked for the first time. "This is a mistake." Sarah's voice, sharp and full of venom, rang out across the room. "You can't do this. I'm your daughter. This isn't right." Elizabeth watched her, calm and composed, as Sarah's anger started to spiral. This wasn't just about the will anymore. This was about losing everything: control, power, and the ability to manipulate the people around her. Elizabeth could see it now, clearly, the desperation in Sarah's eyes. Her world was crumbling, and all she could do was lash out. "You have no right to do this to me," Sarah spat, standing up abruptly, her chair scraping across the floor. "You've destroyed everything. I've been nothing but loyal, and you throw me away like I'm nothing." Elizabeth stood slowly, her movements deliberate, measured. The weight of the years of emotional abuse, the manipulation, the guilt, had all led to this moment. She hadn't taken pleasure in Sarah's fall from grace, but she had finally found the strength to stand tall in the truth. "You made your choice, Sarah," Elizabeth said, her voice calm and steady, her words cutting through the chaos. "Now you'll live with the consequences." The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. There were no dramatic outbursts, no wild accusations, just the weight of the decision hanging in the air. Sarah looked at her mother, her face twisted with a mix of disbelief and rage, and for the first time in years, Elizabeth didn't feel the pull of guilt. She wasn't apologizing. She wasn't backing down. Richard, who had remained composed throughout the hearing, leaned slightly toward Elizabeth, his voice quiet but full of reassurance. "It's over, Elizabeth. The judgment is final." Elizabeth nodded, but her gaze remained on Sarah, who was still standing, her fists clenched at her sides. For a moment, Sarah didn't speak. The weight of what had just happened seemed to paralyze her. The room was silent, save for the faint rustle of papers, as everyone watched Sarah, waiting for her next move. Finally, it came, a flicker of realization, a realization that this fight was lost. Sarah's shoulders sagged slightly, but her defiance remained. She turned to her lawyer, Kate Landon, who had remained a few paces away, her face stony and unreadable. With a nod, Kate walked over to the judge's bench, muttering something to him, before she turned back to Sarah, her expression one of quiet resignation. The lawyer's lips moved, a few low words exchanged, before she dropped her gaze to the floor and signaled for Sarah to leave the courtroom. It was done. Kate Landon had dropped the case. As Sarah turned away, Elizabeth felt a small but significant shift in the air. This was no longer just a legal battle. It was over. The pieces had fallen into place, and now, the power was finally in Elizabeth's hands. She glanced at David, who had been watching from the back of the room. He hadn't intervened, had not taken sides publicly. But now, as their eyes met across the courtroom, she saw something in his expression, something she hadn't dared to hope for. It wasn't support, not yet, but understanding. He had watched the truth unfold, and now he saw her for who she was, a woman who had made a choice not out of anger, but out of the necessity of self-preservation. As the room began to empty, Elizabeth made her way toward the exit. Richard followed beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. She was about to step into a new chapter of her life, one where she would no longer be defined by the toxic hold Sarah had on her. Outside the courthouse, the sun was shining brightly, and Elizabeth paused for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision, both the finality of it and the sense of freedom that had replaced the weight of years of guilt. She was free now, free from the manipulations, the guilt, and the emotional chains that had held her captive for so long. "Thank you," she said quietly to Richard as they walked toward the car. He gave her a small, knowing smile. "You did it, Elizabeth. You made the right choice." As they entered the car, Elizabeth's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, the screen lighting up with a text from Sarah. "You'll regret this. I'll make you regret it. This isn't over." Elizabeth stared at the words for a moment, feeling a brief flicker of the old fear, the fear that had kept her trapped in Sarah's web for so long. But then, just as quickly, she silenced the phone, tucked it back into her bag, and turned her gaze forward. It was over. Sarah had lost. And now, for the first time in years, Elizabeth could see a future ahead of her that was her own, free from manipulation, free from guilt. She wasn't looking back anymore. The days following the verdict passed in a blur, each one blending seamlessly into the next. For Elizabeth, the weight of the decision, the relief of it, settled around her like a protective cocoon. The courtroom battle, the finality of the judgment, had been intense. But now there was space. There was quiet. For the first time in years, Elizabeth felt the absence of guilt, the absence of fear. She was free. Meanwhile, Sarah's world had begun to crumble. It started slowly at first, The calls from creditors, the whispers from the few remaining friends who had been loyal only when it was convenient, began to pile up. Sarah had always relied on Elizabeth's wealth, her steady financial support, and now that it was gone, the fragile web of control she had built around herself began to unravel. Elizabeth wasn't there to pick up the phone anymore, to give her money when she demanded it, to bail her out when things got too hard. Sarah had always believed her mother's success was her inheritance, not something she had to earn. Without that cushion, the reality of her life began to hit hard. The apartment she had lived in for so long, the lifestyle she had taken for granted, all began slipping out of her grasp. Calls went unanswered, loans went unpaid, and the world she had lived in, one of ease and entitlement, turned into a nightmare of bills and deadlines. Elizabeth, on the other hand, continued to live her life with peace. She spent her days immersed in the things that mattered to her: personal growth, charitable work, and the simple joy of knowing she no longer had to hide. The years of Sarah's manipulation felt like a distant memory now. She focused on her foundation, on giving back, on the causes that had always been close to her heart. It was as if the shackles had fallen away, and she was finally free to step into the life she had always dreamed of, one that had nothing to do with guilt, nothing to do with appeasing the demands of a daughter who had never cared for her. It wasn't long before the phone calls started. One after another, family members reached out, apologizing for not standing up sooner, for not seeing the truth that had been right in front of them all along. They had seen the manipulation. They had seen Sarah's behavior. But for too long, they had stayed silent, too afraid of the family rift, too unwilling to take a side. Elizabeth listened to each of them, the apologies sincere but laced with regret. "I should have said something earlier," one of her cousins admitted. "I saw how she treated you, but I didn't want to make waves." Another call came from her brother, a voice filled with both sorrow and relief. "I'm sorry, Liz. I didn't know how bad it had gotten. I should have been there for you." She appreciated their words, but there was no turning back. She had made her choice, and Sarah had made hers. There was no more room for excuses. No more room for silence. For too long they had all allowed Sarah to manipulate their family, and now Elizabeth was the one who had finally taken a stand. As Elizabeth listened, she felt a quiet satisfaction, not for their apologies, but for the clarity that had come from her decision. She wasn't interested in being a martyr anymore, in making everyone else comfortable at the cost of her own peace. She wasn't interested in fixing the damage Sarah had caused, in mending the family that had been fractured by years of control. "I appreciate your words," Elizabeth said quietly after a long pause on the line. "But it's over now. I'm done looking back. I'm finally free of the burden." She wasn't angry, wasn't seeking revenge. She wasn't even bitter. She simply didn't have the energy to keep looking behind her anymore. The life she had built, her work, her legacy, was what mattered now. It wasn't just about money or success. It was about integrity. It was about living a life that was her own, free from the manipulations of others. Sarah's struggles were her own now, and Elizabeth had made her peace with that. She didn't care about the gossip that Sarah would spread, or the lies she would continue to tell in a desperate attempt to reclaim control. Sarah had made her choices, and now Elizabeth was free to make hers. There were times when she felt a brief pang of sympathy. The woman who had once been her daughter, who had once filled her world with hope and love, was now a stranger, a woman who had lost everything in the pursuit of entitlement. But that sympathy didn't last long. Elizabeth had spent too many years in Sarah's shadow. She had given too much of herself to a person who would never give back, and so she focused on what was in front of her: her charitable endeavors, the work that brought her joy and purpose, the people who supported her and respected her decisions. She began traveling more, meeting with other women who shared her passion for empowering those who had been overlooked or forgotten. She poured her energy into projects that gave her life meaning. Every now and then, Elizabeth would hear about Sarah's struggles. There were rumors of her living in a smaller apartment now, of scrambling to find work, of attempting to re-enter a world that had moved on without her. But Elizabeth didn't react. She didn't respond. She didn't let Sarah's chaos invade her world anymore. Sarah had chosen her path, and Elizabeth had chosen hers. And as she looked out the window one quiet evening, the horizon stretching wide before her, Elizabeth knew one thing for certain. She had finally found peace. And no one, not even Sarah, could take that away from her. Elizabeth sat at her desk, the soft glow of the afternoon sun filtering through the large windows, casting long shadows across the room. The view before her was one she had come to cherish. The skyline of the city, a testament to the life she had built. One that had taken years of hard work, sacrifice, and determination. But as she looked out at the vast expanse of possibility, she knew it wasn't enough to simply exist in this world. She wanted to leave something lasting, something that would endure long after she was gone. She had made her decision. Her wealth, her resources, everything she had accumulated over the years, would be used for good. Not to feed Sarah's insatiable hunger for more, but to empower those who had truly earned her respect. Elizabeth had seen firsthand the damage caused by manipulation, greed, and entitlement. Now she would invest her wealth in causes that mattered. Causes that would help people who wanted to change their lives, not take them from others. She reached for the stack of proposals that had been waiting for her attention for days. Programs for at-risk youth, women's shelters, environmental initiatives, and educational foundations. These were the things that would matter. These were the things that would make a difference. Elizabeth had spent too much of her life in the shadows of people like Sarah, people who sought to tear down rather than build up. But now, she had the opportunity to create something far more powerful, a legacy that would inspire, a legacy rooted in integrity and generosity, a legacy she could be proud of. As she signed the first check, directed to a women's education fund in a small village overseas, she felt a rush of peace. This was her gift to the world. This was her way of making sure that her story wasn't just about the pain she had endured, but about the strength she had found in the aftermath. It was the story of a woman who had learned that true power didn't come from wealth or influence, but from the ability to choose. And she had chosen this. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Elizabeth didn't recognize the number, but she answered anyway, unsure of what to expect. "Hello, Mom," Sarah's voice came through, tentative. But there was an edge to it that Elizabeth recognized all too well. "I've been trying to get in touch with you." Elizabeth's pulse didn't quicken. It didn't feel like a call she had to take. This was a person from her past, someone who had used every ounce of her energy to drain her. She could feel the old patterns of manipulation beginning to surface even through the phone line. "I know you're upset," Sarah continued, "but I'm your daughter. I shouldn't have to be shut out like this. I've been through a lot. I need you." Elizabeth felt the stirrings of old resentment, but she held firm. She was no longer the woman Sarah had relied on, the woman who would drop everything to give her what she wanted. No. She had learned too much to fall back into that cycle. "You've made your choices, Sarah," Elizabeth said calmly, her voice firm. "You've taken everything you could from me, and now it's time for you to stand on your own. I've worked too hard to build something that matters to let you take it from me. I can't keep enabling you." The silence on the other end was deafening, but Elizabeth didn't flinch. She had expected this. Sarah's attempts at guilt-tripping, her desperation to reclaim control, none of it worked anymore. "You're making a mistake," Sarah hissed, the venom clear in her words. "You'll regret it. You're nothing without me." Elizabeth's eyes narrowed, but she remained composed. I already made my peace with that. You're not my responsibility anymore, Sarah. The call ended abruptly, the finality of it echoing in the stillness of Elizabeth's office. She felt nothing. No relief, no regret, only a quiet certainty that this was the right path. She didn't need Sarah's approval. She didn't need anyone's approval. She had her own. In the weeks that followed, Elizabeth's new life began to take shape in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her charitable work flourished, and her impact grew. She was featured in articles, celebrated for her resilience, and her commitment to giving back. People who had once only known her as the wealthy, quiet woman were beginning to understand who she really was. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a force for good. Sarah, meanwhile, continued to struggle. Rumors trickled in through the grapevine. There were whispers of her financial troubles, of her struggle to maintain a lifestyle she no longer had the means to support. She had attempted to reach out to other family members, hoping someone would take pity on her, but the tide had shifted. People had seen the truth. They had seen what she had done to Elizabeth, and couldn't ignore it any longer. One afternoon, Elizabeth received a call from a family member, someone who had once been close to Sarah. The voice on the other end was hesitant, almost apologetic. "I'm sorry, Liz," the voice said. "We should have seen it sooner. You were right. She's been using us all. I didn't want to believe it, but now I can't ignore it anymore." Elizabeth's response was simple. "I've made my peace, and you should too." The freedom she had longed for had come, not from financial success or approval from others, but from the ability to let go. She didn't need to fix Sarah's mistakes. She didn't need to heal every broken relationship. She had done enough. Now it was time to focus on the people who truly deserved her time and energy. And as she stood on the balcony of her apartment one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Elizabeth knew that her legacy, one of strength, generosity, and resilience, was just beginning. This was her story now, and no one could take that from her. Sarah's struggle was her own, and Elizabeth had no more room for that chaos in her life. The horizon before her was wide, filled with infinite possibilities, and for the first time, Elizabeth felt truly free to walk her own path. Elizabeth stood at the window, the sun beginning its slow descent beyond the horizon. The soft pink and orange hues of the evening sky painted the cityscape, stretching across the glass in a vibrant canvas. She let the scene wash over her, feeling an almost meditative calm settle into her bones. For the first time in years, there was a quietness around her that felt complete. She had always thought peace was something elusive, something to chase. But now, she understood. Peace wasn't found outside of herself. It was something she chose. The silence in her apartment wasn't just the absence of noise. It was the absence of emotional clutter. For so long, Sarah's voice had been the loudest, constantly demanding, criticizing, and manipulating. The echoes of those years still lingered, but they had faded. In their place was space. Space for her own thoughts, her own life, her own path. Elizabeth poured herself a glass of wine and sat at the small table by the window. She had learned, over the past few months, that life didn't need to be a constant rush. She didn't have to fill every moment with noise, with activity, with people. It was enough to simply exist. She spent her days working on personal projects, some related to her foundation, others creative outlets she had long forgotten. It was liberating to let herself rest, to breathe without the weight of obligation. The phone buzzed, breaking her reverie. It was a message from Maya. "Dinner tomorrow night? I'll be at the usual spot. Let's celebrate your freedom." A small smile crept across Elizabeth's face. She hadn't needed to be reminded, but it was a welcome thought. She had begun to surround herself with people who truly valued her, not for what she could give, but for who she was. Maya had been one of the first to stand by her when the family had remained silent. Their friendship had deepened in the wake of everything that had happened, and now it was as if the old weight had evaporated. It was a relationship built on mutual respect, not manipulation. Dinner the next evening was a celebration of peace, of having reclaimed control over her life. As they clinked glasses, Maya raised hers with a grin. To freedom, Elizabeth. To choosing your own future. Elizabeth met her gaze, a sense of serenity flowing through her. To peace, she said, her voice calm and resolute. Across the city, Sarah's world had become one of constant struggle. Without the financial cushion she had relied on, without the safety net of Elizabeth's resources, Sarah was finding it difficult to maintain her lifestyle. Her once lavish apartment had been sold, and the money had barely covered her debts. There were no more calls to make to Elizabeth, no more expectations of a handout. Sarah's world, built on the belief that her mother owed her everything, was unraveling quickly. She had tried to reconnect with Elizabeth, of course. There were the occasional angry pleading messages, each one more desperate than the last. But Elizabeth had learned not to respond. She had made her choice. And now Sarah's manipulations were nothing more than noise. Sarah had no power over her anymore. The first time Elizabeth had ignored one of Sarah's messages, she felt a small pang of guilt. It didn't last long. The guilt faded into something stronger, an overwhelming sense of relief. That was the moment Elizabeth realized that she wasn't just choosing peace in her life, but protecting it. She had been so accustomed to answering to someone else's whims, to sacrificing her own needs for the sake of others, that she hadn't understood the depth of her own strength. It wasn't that Elizabeth wanted Sarah to suffer. She didn't. But there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that she had finally taken control of her own story. She had been the one who had been wronged, but instead of continuing the cycle of damage, she had chosen to move forward. Days turned into weeks, and Elizabeth continued to thrive. She spent more time with people who truly appreciated her, old friends who had always supported her, new acquaintances who respected her work, and, of course, Maya, who had become her pillar. They traveled together, exploring new cities, meeting new people, and often reflecting on how far Elizabeth had come. Elizabeth also continued to expand her charitable work, but now it was different. She wasn't just writing checks. She was actively involved, meeting with recipients, attending fundraisers, and even mentoring young women who shared her passion for social change. Her influence had grown, and so had her confidence. She was not just the woman who had been taken advantage of. She was a force in her own right, a woman who had chosen to rise above. Sarah's attempts to re-enter Elizabeth's life were, as expected, ignored. Each message, each call, was met with silence. Elizabeth didn't care anymore. She had learned that the best way to move on from toxicity was to stop feeding it. Months passed, and Elizabeth's life took on a rhythm of calm and fulfillment. She found herself at peace, not because everything was perfect, life had its own chaos after all, but because she no longer allowed anyone or anything to control her narrative. One evening, while standing on the balcony, watching the city lights flicker like stars below, Elizabeth felt a deep sense of contentment. She had not only survived, she had thrived. She was finally free from the chains of manipulation that had once bound her, and she had created a life filled with purpose. The phone buzzed again, but this time it was a message from one of her supporters. "Elizabeth, thank you. You've made such a difference in my life." The words were simple, but they were the ones that truly mattered. Elizabeth smiled to herself, knowing that the peace she had chosen wasn't just the absence of chaos. It was the presence of everything she had always longed for, and now she would live it fully. It was early morning when the text came through, a simple message from an unknown number. Elizabeth's phone buzzed quietly on the nightstand, pulling her from a deep sleep. She stretched and reached for it, her fingers brushing the screen. The message was brief, the words cold and demanding. "We need to talk. This isn't over." The name at the top was unmistakable. Sarah. Elizabeth stared at the screen for a long moment, feeling the familiar knot tighten in her stomach. It had been months since she had last heard from her daughter. After Sarah's final desperate attempts to reach her, she had finally accepted the silence that had followed. Elizabeth had worked hard to put that part of her life behind her. Yet here it was again, an unwelcome reminder of the chaos that had once consumed her. But this time, Elizabeth didn't feel that familiar twinge of guilt. She didn't feel the pull to respond, to explain herself. The old patterns, the guilt trips, the manipulations, none of it had the power it once did. It had been replaced by something stronger. A calm certainty that Sarah's time in her life was over. She let the message sit there, unread, for a few minutes longer before she turned the phone over and set it face down. Instead of diving into the past, she focused on what lay ahead. The next few months were filled with new beginnings. Elizabeth threw herself into her work, expanding her charitable efforts into new projects that ignited her passion. She had never felt more alive, more purpose-driven. Her days were filled with meetings, collaborations, and opportunities to speak with young women who looked to her as a role model. The foundation she had spent years building was beginning to thrive, and she was using her resources to effect real change in the world. Elizabeth began mentoring young women in her community, offering guidance and support to those who had faced similar challenges, those who had been silenced, manipulated, or overlooked. Through her own experiences, she had learned to build resilience, and now she was passing that strength on. She spent hours with these women, many of whom had faced their own battles against manipulation and control, and watched as they blossomed, finding their own voices, their own paths. In a way, helping them heal was also healing something inside of Elizabeth herself. She was teaching them to take back their power, to stand strong in the face of adversity. In turn, they were teaching her the meaning of true legacy. As her influence grew, Elizabeth's role in the public eye shifted. No longer a quiet figure behind the scenes, she became an advocate for women's empowerment, for mental health, and for independence. People saw her not just as the successful businesswoman, but as a woman who had taken control of her life, no longer defined by the manipulations of those around her. Elizabeth's wisdom and strength became an inspiration to countless others. She was invited to speak at conferences, to appear on panels, to contribute to think tanks focused on social change. Her voice resonated with others who had lived in the shadows of powerful people, and slowly, Elizabeth became a beacon of hope for those who were still finding their way out of toxic situations. All the while, Sarah's world continued to spiral. The reality of her situation was impossible to ignore. Without Elizabeth's financial support, Sarah found herself struggling to maintain the lifestyle she had grown accustomed to. She had burned bridges with family members, friends, and colleagues. The walls she had built around herself began to crumble, leaving her isolated and desperate. The calls from Sarah continued, but each one was more frantic than the last. One message read, "I need help, Mom, please. I'm sorry for everything. I've learned my lesson." But Elizabeth saw through it all. She knew Sarah had no real remorse. She was just trying to regain control, to manipulate her one last time. Elizabeth never responded. Instead, she chose to focus on the women who deserved her attention, the people who were building futures for themselves, just as she was building her own. Sarah's absence in her life wasn't just a relief, it was a confirmation that she had made the right choice. The media began to pick up on Elizabeth's story. Articles, interviews, and profiles started to appear in major publications. She was celebrated for her courage, for her ability to break free from the toxic hold of her daughter and to reclaim her life. But Elizabeth didn't revel in the attention. She knew the truth. Her journey had never been about recognition. It had been about finding herself again, about rediscovering her purpose. Sarah, on the other hand, continued to sink deeper into isolation. Her attempts to rebuild her life were met with failure. The few friends who had remained in her circle began to disappear as they witnessed the same toxic behavior she had always exhibited. People started to see her for what she truly was: a manipulator, a user, someone who was willing to tear others down for her own gain. One afternoon, while meeting with a group of young women at her foundation's headquarters, Elizabeth received a call from a family member. It was her brother. There was a long pause before he spoke, his voice heavy. "I don't know if you've heard, but Sarah's in real trouble now. She's lost everything." Elizabeth's heart didn't race. There was no anger, no satisfaction, just a quiet acceptance. She had already let go of the weight of Sarah's choices. "I heard," Elizabeth replied softly, "and I'm sorry it's come to this, but she made her choice. She's not my responsibility anymore." Her brother's voice softened. "I understand. I wish we had done more sooner. She's really lost everything." Elizabeth felt a pang of sympathy, but it was brief, fleeting. She had no room left in her heart for regret. Sarah had chosen this path. Elizabeth had chosen a different one, a path of freedom, of self-respect, of giving back to those who truly needed her. And as she looked out at the horizon once more, Elizabeth knew with certainty that the future was hers to shape. The struggle was behind her, and in its place was a future she had reclaimed, not just for herself, but for everyone she helped along the way. The chapter with Sarah was closed. The story that lay ahead was hers, and only hers, to write. Elizabeth stepped into the quiet lobby of her foundation's new headquarters, the soft hum of activity greeting her like a familiar melody. The building, 6 glass-walled floors overlooking the heart of San Francisco, had once been nothing more than an ambitious dream sketched on a piece of paper. Now it bustled with life. Interns shuffling between offices, volunteers sorting paperwork, the low murmur of meetings taking place behind partially open doors. It was everything she hoped it would be: impactful, purposeful, alive. As she walked toward the elevator, she caught glimpses of the work being done, a conference room where a group of young women discussed their next community outreach event, an office where a team was assembling care packages for domestic violence survivors, a small studio where volunteers were filming a documentary highlighting underrepresented voices in the city. Her legacy was no longer theoretical. It was breathing. The foundation had grown faster than anyone anticipated. Grants poured in. Partnerships formed. And at the center of it all, Elizabeth stood as a testament to resilience, a woman who had endured manipulation, heartbreak, and betrayal, but had chosen to rise rather than break. Upstairs, in her office, she sat behind her desk, sorting through the weekly reports. There were numbers, charts, updates on programs, each one a reminder that her choices had led to something powerful. The kind of generational impact she had once only dreamed of. Outside her window, the city's skyline stretched across the horizon, the late afternoon sun casting long beams of golden light across the room. Elizabeth sat in that glow, a soft smile playing at the corner of her lips. She had built something that mattered. But while her world thrived, Sarah's continued to collapse. Elizabeth rarely heard updates about her daughter now. Only the occasional whisper from a distant relative, or a short mention buried deep in a voicemail she never returned. She knew Sarah was struggling, both financially and emotionally. The support systems she once exploited were gone. The friends who benefited from her extravagant lifestyle had drifted away. The web of manipulation she had woven for years had finally caught up with her, leaving her alone with the consequences. Elizabeth felt no satisfaction in that knowledge. There was no triumph, no vindication, only a quiet understanding that this outcome had always been inevitable. Sarah had chosen her path, and Elizabeth had finally chosen hers. What mattered now was the work she was doing, the lives she was touching. Later that week, Elizabeth attended a gala held in her honor. Cameras flashed as she stepped inside, but the attention no longer made her uneasy. She had been thrust into the public eye unexpectedly, her story inspiring thousands, maybe millions. News outlets had picked up on her journey, the court battle, the emotional freedom, the transformation that came after. Her courage had become a symbol, living proof that breaking away from toxicity wasn't an act of cruelty, but an act of survival. On stage, Elizabeth delivered her speech with grace. She spoke about resilience, about self-worth, about finding strength even in the darkest corners of one's life. When the applause erupted, loud, long, filled with warmth, Elizabeth felt something deepen inside her. Not pride, exactly, but peace. A soft, quiet peace that had been denied to her for decades. After the gala, she slipped away early, choosing instead to spend her evening in the sanctuary of her home. The city lights flickered outside her windows, casting their colorful glow across her living room. A cup of tea warmed her hands as she settled into her favorite chair, listening to the soft rustle of nighttime traffic several stories below. She thought about the women she had mentored, the organizations she had helped, the lives she had touched, simply by choosing to redirect her energy away from chaos and into purpose. Her legacy wasn't wealth, it wasn't status. It was the lives she changed, the women she empowered, the hope she sparked in others. Sarah's shadow no longer hung over her life. It had dissolved into the past along with all the whispers of manipulation. Elizabeth didn't look back. She refused to. The future ahead of her was far too bright. And as she sat in that peaceful room, surrounded by the quiet she had once feared but now fully embraced, she understood something profound. Her story would continue long after she was gone, not in court records or dramatic headlines, but in the impact she had made, in the people she had lifted up, in the strength she had chosen. Her legacy would outlive the turmoil. It would outshine the hurt. It would stand, long after Sarah's manipulations had faded into oblivion. Elizabeth exhaled softly, a gentle smile forming. Tomorrow she had another meeting, another young woman to mentor, another life to change, and she was ready for it. Ready for all of it, because this time, the future belonged entirely to her. Elizabeth stood backstage, the soft hum of the auditorium just beyond the curtain. She could hear the murmur of the crowd, a sea of voices rising and falling in anticipation. It had been a long time since she had spoken in front of such a large audience. But now, with every passing moment, her heart remained steady. No nerves, no anxiety, only a deep, grounding peace. The spotlight flickered to life as the MC called her name. The applause surged. Her time had come. As she walked onto the stage, her eyes scanned the crowd, her gaze sweeping across a sea of expectant faces. Women, men, community leaders, young activists, people who had come from all corners of the world to hear her speak, to be inspired by her journey. Elizabeth's breath steadied as she reached the podium, a calm smile forming on her lips. "Good evening," she began, her voice warm but firm, every word measured, every breath deliberate. "I stand before you today, not as a survivor, not as a victim, but as a woman who reclaimed her peace." The room grew still, the energy shifting as her words sunk in. She had learned, over the years, that peace wasn't something handed to you, it was something you created. Peace was not the absence of conflict, but the courage to stand firm in the face of it. I spent years building a life to prove myself, Elizabeth continued, her hands steady as they rested on the podium. I sacrificed my peace to keep others happy, to make them comfortable with my success. But in doing so, I lost myself. I lost sight of my own worth. It wasn't until I chose to stop enabling the very people who tried to take from me that I found what truly mattered. It wasn't the wealth, it wasn't the accolades, it was my peace. The crowd remained silent, hanging on every word. Elizabeth's story was not just her own, it was the story of so many others, women who had been told their worth was in what they could give, in how much they could sacrifice. Elizabeth was no longer that woman, and now, she was ready to lead others to their own truth. I know what it's like to be pushed to the edge, she said, her eyes sweeping across the room, finding the faces of women who nodded in silent understanding. To feel like you've given everything and still not be enough. To feel like the world will fall apart if you stop giving, if you stop sacrificing. But I've learned the most powerful thing we can do for ourselves is to say no. To say no to the manipulations, to the lies, to the people who don't deserve our love or our energy. The applause broke out, but Elizabeth was unshaken. She wasn't seeking validation anymore. She had found it in herself. Peace is not a luxury, it's a necessity, Elizabeth said, her voice strong now, reverberating with the quiet strength she had built over the years. And once you've created it for yourself, you can change the world. You can build something that lasts. You can empower others to do the same. Elizabeth felt a surge of warmth as the crowd erupted into applause, but she didn't linger on it. Her eyes, calm and focused, looked beyond the stage, past the bright lights and the eager faces, to something deeper, something that only she understood. This moment, this speech, wasn't just about the people in the room. It was about everything she had built, everything she had learned. It was a reflection of the peace she had fought so hard to claim. As she finished her speech and stepped away from the podium, the roar of the audience followed her backstage. The rush of exhilaration was there, but it was quiet now. It was different from the loud, overwhelming rush of her past. This was a peaceful kind of satisfaction. Back in her private space, Elizabeth took a deep breath, letting the calmness of the moment settle in. Her journey had brought her here, to this stage, to this audience. She had faced years of manipulation, emotional turmoil, and heartache, but none of it had the power to define her anymore. What mattered now was how she chose to live, how she chose to lead, how she chose to inspire. As she looked out at the world she was creating, Elizabeth realized that her true legacy was no longer defined by the things she had accumulated, the wealth she had built, or even the battles she had fought. Her legacy was in the lives she had touched, the people she had empowered. Her legacy was in the women she mentored, the causes she supported, the hope she had given to those who thought peace was a dream they could never reach. And Sarah? Sarah was a distant memory now, fading into the background of Elizabeth's story, a brief chapter that had taught her everything she needed to know about strength, self-worth, and resilience. The manipulations, the guilt trips, the years of toxic influence, they were gone. They no longer had power over her, no longer had a hold on her future. Outside, the world continued. The city lights twinkled below, the endless hum of life continuing on, unaffected by the past. Elizabeth stood in the quiet of her private space, the noise of the world no longer a burden. She had found her peace, and now she was ready to build a future, not for herself alone, but for the people who needed her. Her phone buzzed. Another message from a young woman she had mentored. "Thank you, Elizabeth. You changed my life." Elizabeth smiled, her heart swelling with a quiet, deep satisfaction. They tried to take everything from me, she whispered to herself, the words echoing with truth. But they never took my peace. She turned her gaze to the horizon, where the first light of dawn was just beginning to break. The future was bright, and it was hers to shape.